All right. Well, I guess I can go ahead and kick us off. Hello and welcome to the Committee for Education Funding, also known as CEF's annual budget book briefing, titled Education Matters, Investing in America's Future, CEF's FY 2023 Education Budget Book. My name is Emmanuel Guillory, and I do serve as the president of CEF this year. CEF is the nation's oldest and largest educational coalition and provides a strong and unified voice in support of increasing federal investments in education. CEF was founded in 1969 and includes more than 100 educational associations, institutions, and other entities. And so I hope you are excited as I am for today's briefing because we get a chance to hear from four outstanding panelists. And they will be introduced later. But I would like to quickly introduce you to the CEF's officer team who will be helping me in today's briefing. And so hopefully you can all still hear me and see me. I just had something close down on me. I don't know why, but hopefully you can still hear me. So CEF's vice president is Danny Carlson, and he is with the National Association of Elementary School Principals. And our CEF's treasurer this year is Jenny Smolson, and she is with the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities. We also have Luis Maldonado, who's serving as past president for CEF this year, and he is with the American Association on State Colleges and Universities. And so both Danny and Jenny are going to help us throughout the briefing. Danny's going to help with introducing the panelists and moderating questions, and Jenny's going to close us out. But last but not least, I would like to introduce our executive director, Sarah Abernathy, who pretty much serves as the brains and operations of CEF. She has had a number of roles serving on the budget committee, working in the Department of Education, and is just such an expert at what she does, and it's absolutely fantastic. And so with that warm welcome, I would like to turn it over to our executive director, Sarah Abernathy.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and welcome to the briefing. I promise I will be very brief because I think what we're all here to hear from is the panelists who are talking about how education funding matters in the worlds that they work in. But it wouldn't be a CEF briefing if I didn't do a tiny bit of recapping of where we are in education funding and maybe throw up a chart or two. So Max, if you mind, start the slides. The next slide. Wanted to talk a little bit about where we are with education, federal education funding. This slide shows funding for the Department of Ed for the last 10 years or so. Obviously, there's education funding that exists outside the Department of Education, but it's a pretty good proxy for what the federal government does. And you can see the three green bars representing the pandemic relief that Congress provided in 2020 and 2021 for across the education continuum, which was very much needed and designed to address specific problems caused by the pandemic. But as you can see, funding for Department of Ed for the 10 years before that had really been flat. And in fact, 2011 was the high water mark until 2018. This is nominal dollars, not inflation adjusted dollars. And you can see that in 2022, despite a $2 billion increase in what Congress just provided, funding is just barely bigger than it was over 11 years ago. And in fact, in inflation adjusted terms, it is $12 billion below the level of 2011. And in fact, needs for education funding have grown significantly since then. The president for this coming year in 2023 has proposed a 17%, $13 billion increase for the Department of Ed. 2/3 of that is for K-12 funding, with almost all of it for Title I and special education, IDEA, which are the two biggest K-12 funding programs. Next slide, please. This is just another way to show how federal education funding has been really frozen, except that K-12 funding has gone up a little bit over the years. So, but the fact is the public wants more education funding. Congress hasn't, can you hit the next slide, please? We did a poll a year ago, and 2/3 of voters believe that the federal government spent too little. Excluding the pandemic relief, education funding has been for decades about 2% of the federal budget. So even when the federal budget went up, education stayed about the same share. Under the president's budget next year, spending for education would increase to 3.6% of the federal budget, but a lot of that is just the tail end of the pandemic relief going out. Congress has not decided yet what to do for fiscal year 23. Congress is still discussing not only the total amount of appropriations to provide, but how to divide it among the 12 government funding bills, and then within the bills, how much to provide for each program. So that's where our advocacy comes in. The next slide, please. The CEF's education budget book, which we're releasing today, and which everyone who's attending here can get an electronic copy, is a real encyclopedia of education funding from the federal government. It has an article about every national education program, describing the funding history, a vignette about how the funding works in the classroom or wherever it occurs, discussing the need and the impact of the president's budget. And importantly, for those who are working on education funding, it has the contact information for the CEF member who wrote the article. So if you want to ask an expert a question about how a program works, you have access to that person. So we hope this is a useful document. And today what we have is 4 experts from different parts of the education continuum who can talk about how federal education funding matters in what they are doing. With that, I'd like to, we can turn off the slides, and I want to turn it over to Danny Carlson to introduce our panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that great intro. I get the distinct pleasure of introducing our all-star panel, which is why we're all here. I had a chance to read through the bios and look a little bit at the background of some of these folks, and I think it's a microcosm of what CEF is, which is it stretches the whole continuum, and it is folks from all these different sectors. That is really the power of the need for education funding across the board. So without further ado, our panelists. Our first panelist is James Boothby. He's the superintendent of schools for Regional School Unit 25, a rural school district in Maine serving the communities of Bucksport, Orland, Prosper, and Verona Island. He's been an educator for 31 years and has served as a teacher, coach, bus driver, athletic administrator, assistant principal, and for the past 15 years, superintendent of schools. Jim is currently the president of the Maine School Superintendents Association. We also have with us Dr. Hakim Lucas. He's the president of Virginia Union University, a historically Black university founded in 1865 in Richmond, Virginia, that provides undergraduate liberal arts programs and graduate education for Christian ministries. He's a strong advocate for student-driven policies and the inclusiveness of students and faculty in developing and implementing the university's strategic plan. With more than 2 decades of experience in higher education, Dr. Lucas's success includes fundraising, strategic planning, and the engagement and retention of students in challenging educational experiences. Next, Jennifer Harris. Jennifer is the founder and president of CR Search Inc., an executive search-based firm in Gurnee, Illinois, and the chairwoman of the National Association of Workforce Boards. She previously chaired and is currently a member of the Lake County Workforce Development Board. She's also the past chairwoman of the Zacharias Sexual Abuse Center Board of Directors and current advisory board member for Northside Community Bank. And finally, Patience Frederiksen. Patience grew up in Rhode Island and has made Alaska her home since 1979. She has worked for the Alaska State Library and the Alaska Division of Libraries, Archives, and Museums for 33 years, advancing from Librarian 1 through Librarian 4 before becoming Division Director in 2016. She reports that she not only knows where all the skeletons are buried, but she actually knew many of them. And I think I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists to provide their presentations. And I think James is going to kick us off.
Thanks, Danny. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And I'm happy to share a little bit of a story here in rural Maine. In RSU 25, we're very fortunate to receive federal funding to support our programming throughout the educational continuum. And as a rural school district, we look for ways to improve our educational opportunities and leverage our funding, both local and federal funding through partnerships and collaborations. And that's really, truly how we are able to provide the programming we can. One example of this is our collaboration with Head Start. And because of the partnership with Head Start, we're able to offer a full day school year 4-year-old pre-K program. And to maximize the opportunities for the 4-year-olds in our district, the partnership with Head Start has allowed us to do just this, to leverage the local and federal dollars to provide a high quality programming for the students. To go along with this, early childhood programming and are critical for students to have a great start to their journey of education. Investment in early childhood educational programming and quality childcare program is very important, not only for education of our youngest students, but I believe is critical to support our working families and our economy. In RSU 25, we also are involved in a collaboration for technical education with the Hancock County Technical Center. And this program provides our students with opportunities for technical education through a broad spectrum. The countywide collaboration also includes a bridge year program, which allows technical students to earn college credits while in high school. Another exciting partnership through the technical program is a partnership with a private program, Jackson Laboratory, world leader in medical research. And this biomedical program allows our students to learn cutting edge research techniques and prepare for post-secondary experiences through not only day-to-day programming, but internships as well. I speak of this because the use of federal money through the Perkins funds is critical to support career technical education programming and to provide opportunities for students who are pursuing a pathway in the trades, as well as looking forward to post-secondary. These students will play a critical role in our economy for years to come, and providing them high quality, updated programming and equipment to use prepares them for their careers. We're very fortunate to receive federal title program money, and that plays a crucial role in supporting our student academic growth and our ability to meet their learning needs. In a district where we have more than 50% of our families qualifying for free and reduced lunch programs, the ability to offer a whole school programming to support the academic needs of the students is critical. I do want to point out we are challenged in Maine where the state minimum wage exceeds the federal minimum wage. The disparity between the federal minimum wage and the state minimum wage has created a group of students whose families are just above the qualifying income levels. And that impacts our ability to program for them and also for our district to receive monies. I think it's critically important that the federal government really take a look at the minimum wage. That minimum wage at the federal level has not been adjusted since 2009. And is not reflective of the current economy, nor is it keeping up with the minimum wages established by the states across the country. Additionally, Maine is welcoming many families seeking asylum in the United States. This increased enrollment in many of our schools, especially in southern Maine, is really putting a lot of pressure on the local school districts. Funding to support the McKinney-Vento program and students who are through this program are really related to the Title I funds, and again, based on free and reduced data. Many of the communities that these families are settling in do not receive large amounts of federal money, and some not at all, because of the economic status of the communities. However, the immigration and the influx of students has put significant pressure on these communities. This is something that really needs to be addressed. The distribution of funds for Title I, the definition of the district poverty status needs to be reviewed. I really strongly encourage Congress to consider a reset of the federal minimum wage to reflect the current economic realities of the country, or to find another metric to index the distribution of funds to the states. The next area I'd like to address is the structure of Medicaid reimbursement, which I believe is the third largest funding stream for federal monies to the local districts. These funds are exceedingly difficult to access for reimbursement from a school district's perspective. In RSU 25, we've actually suspended efforts to draw down these money because, quite frankly, it was costing us more money to apply for the funds than we were reimbursed. The structures established for reimbursements are challenging for all school districts, but extremely difficult for rural districts like RSU 25. Yet by federal law, we're required to provide services to qualifying students regardless of funding. In fact, over the past 10 years, RSU 25 has seen a reduction of more than $400,000 in Medicaid monies because of the complexities of the reimbursement program. Coupled with the offset of seed monies, anytime you receive any kind of federal money for Medicaid, your local state distribution is reduced. So now all these additional costs are borne by the local taxpayer. Medicaid monies help pay for the services required under IDEA, and streamlining the reimbursement process would open up a greater access to the funds for districts. This leads me to the last item I would like to discuss, which are the funds districts receive to help fund the required program under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA. When IDEA was established in 1975, the law included a funding level of 40% of the cost of the programming would come from federal funds. I believe in FY22, the funding level is approximately at 15%, well shy of the 40% target. Special education costs represent nearly 20% of my district's annual operating budget, and I'm sure they're a significant portion of budgets across the country. Increasing funding for IDEA will free up local and state funds to be used to improve educational opportunities for all students. Fully funding IDEA would return billions of dollars back to the states and local budgets, making the funds not being used to close the federal funding shortfall available to improve educational opportunities for all students. In closing, the federal funds provided to the states and local school administrative units are vital, and they're used to meet the needs of our students. While I encourage Congress to support the increases represented by President Biden's proposed budget, I do ask them to take a look at the distribution formulas and some of the metrics they're using to make those distributions. That's what I have for you, Danny. Is there anything else?
No, James, I really appreciate it. That's a great start to the panel, and we'll come back to you for questions. But I think Dr. Lucas, if you want to continue the show here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be here also and to follow James and important work that he's doing. To thank CEF and Emmanuel, who has a long, illustrious career in doing research and supporting and promoting, particularly HBCUs in his various roles and organizations that he has played. I will begin my conversation in three important parts as we talk to those who are in the federal government who have the authority and the will to make a difference in the funding formulas. I want to talk first about the importance and the historical importance of HBCUs, and I believe the MSIs and PBIs, that's minority serving institutions and predominantly Black institutions, will also be in the bucket that I will speak about. The second issue that I would like to frame is just about the historical sustainability of the federal support and what it has done. And then the third is I would like to borrow your mind's eye to what you can do with continued funding and what we're looking at President Biden's budget requests and some other initiatives that Congress and senators and others have begun to propose for HBCUs. The first is to understand historically Black colleges and universities, not necessarily by a federal distinction of any title or program, but as a way that America post Reconstruction and Civil War decided to effectuate a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Let us be very, very clear. Great guy, president of Virginia State University, Dr. Nicola Abdullah, if he's watching, hello to you and to others who may be watching. America made a decision that historically Black colleges and universities would be their first diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. When it came to the problem of race, and particularly the problem of the African American and what they would do post-slavery, the issue was the best solution for how to effectuate some level of change, parity, equality, and equity was education, and primarily education through historically Black colleges and universities. I think that that has to be acknowledged and continue to be celebrated as an outcome of one of America's, I think, greatest resources, which is education. We all know that there's no other way, no faster way to attain some level of equality and equity than through education. HBCUs began as Emmanuel, if you are following the book, from page 150 to 154, Emmanuel outlines all his research, and he starts with 1837 as the founding of the first HBCU. By 1865, we end up with a plethora of approximately 108. We're now at 101 accredited institutions that are educating, representing 3% of higher education institutions and educating 16% of African Americans in America. By every standard that Emmanuel outlines and that all of you will see, the special and unique ability of HBCUs to educate, to accelerate, and to sustain African American participation in free market economies, in various industries, and also in owning, if you will, their own intellectual capacity and property to participate fully as a human being in America is what we do at HBCUs. From our academic programs to our support services, the one uniqueness that we know is that other institutions, particularly those that are classified as predominantly white institutions, they have the ability and the luxury to educate persons for careers and to prepare them to go and to make money and to package their life and to package the ways in which they have lived, to be able to leverage them for resources for their families. Unfortunately, predominantly Black institutions, minority serving institutions, and HBCUs, we're challenged to prepare students for life. And what does that mean? It means that the reality of the America that many of us live in, that even though you may have a degree, you may wear a white or green robe in a hospital, or you may go and put on a Black robe and be a judge in a circuit court or appellate division, though you may put on a suit and a tie and be in a corporate boardroom. Sometimes when you get in your car and you drive through windy roads into the suburbs of the various cities and counties in America, that people really only see your skin color. And so how do you go from being a judge, a doctor, a lawyer, a CEO, and become a Black man or woman or Hispanic man or woman in America today? And the lessons of how to survive in this world in which we live. HBCUs, minority serving institutions, PBIs, they prepare students for life. And the question is, how do you, in a 2022, 21st century world, begin to work out what equality, equity, social responsibility really means? And the value of the education today becomes, if you will, the continued cornerstone of HBCUs, not just preparing people for careers, but preparing people for life, and ensuring that the life that you live allows you not to just deal with problems of race, but more increasingly in the 21st century, coming out of W.E.B. Du Bois, into dealing with issues of poverty. There are two numbers that really drive your life: your zip code and your social security number. Unfortunately, for many Americans, your zip code sometimes is the one aspect of who you are that you want to escape. And the escaping of the zip code: where do you live? Where do you come from? What type of support systems will ultimately influence the role that you will play, how much you will make, the accesses that you will ultimately have. Education is the only institution that can transform your zip code into a positive impact on your life. This is why the Pell Grant is considered the cornerstone of African-American education, HBCUs. For over $4 billion through Pell Grants have been given to African-Americans over the years, primarily since post-1965, in which we have considered the fact that African-Americans could not participate in the cost of education and the escalating costs without federal support, and the Pell Grant is that. To see the increases in the Pell Grant is essential because affordability and access are still the two twins of the ability to live and to experience the American dream. When we talk about Pell becomes that cornerstone. However, the foundation of Black higher education and Pell granting, we begin to see the pillars of Black higher education through Title III. For all of those that do not know, Title III, we have to give honor to some great, the shoulders of men and women whose shoulders we stand on, but one was the great President Samuel Nabrit. He's the president of Texas Southern. And he led a delegation of HBCUs back in the 1960s to speak to President Kennedy to begin to talk about and lobby for funding for our institutions. And that lobbying led to the Title III issuance. And for those who don't know Title III's history allows for us to participate in capacity building. That is technology, infrastructure, the support of graduate programs, research, innovation, faculty development, and all of the other issues of parity that white institutions, public institutions, and other majority institutions have enjoyed. The history of Title III is such that HBCUs have been able to increase not only the skill sets of their faculty, because we all know it takes great faculty to create great students, but to allow the participation in research, the increased access to catalogs and libraries, and to uniquely invest in our endowments. When we talk about the history of Pell, allowing direct access to African Americans living below the poverty line and other minorities to participate in education as a way to transcend zip code, to participate fully as a citizen of America. We also see Title III as a historic way to build the institution so that when Pell Grants are used to get our students to the institution then can provide a high quality educational experience that is on par with any institution they'll come from. We clearly see from the products of Howard University to Hampton University to Morehouse to Spelman to Wiley College to Benedict to Claflin to Virginia Union. We all have participated and benefited from the federal government joining with us to produce and provide access to what in 2021 has become a $1.6 trillion buying power. And that's what we're talking about, right? African Americans commanding $1.6 trillion in spending power and buying power in the American economy and being able to earn a fair share of what that is. And unfortunately today, African Americans are still trailing behind white Americans in what they earn after receiving their degrees. The question for us is, so when we talk to legislators, when we talk to those in the federal government, to the corporate community, what do we do now? And now we'll turn to the final leg of my conversation. Well, history is a great teacher. And we begin to say, if you look at one of the oldest educational institutions in this land, it's Harvard University, Harvard Corporation, DBAing as Harvard University. It's the oldest corporation in the Western Hemisphere, been around for just about 483 years. What we do see is that educational institutions are the economic engines of their locale. We understand that when you invest in an educational institution, you are investing in a community. The other thing we see is that educational institutions survive because federal governments support them through departments, through federal grants to do research, that corporations leverage participation with them. Why? Because most corporations, when it comes to the development of widgets or IP, do not want to invest in R&D. They prefer some other place and some other entity to invest, and so they can have direct access to the various widget that they will sell. And then you have the local state governments that also support and come around the university or the college that we have. So, for example, Harvard University, Cambridge, Harvard Square, federal grants, city, state support, and also the corporations that begin to leverage their IP. When all of that happens at the same time, education takes on a miraculous way of providing access, affordability, and the ability to transcend poverty in the circumstances from you arise. For us as HBCUs, the Freedom Summer, we call it, for all those that are watching, it was Freedom Summer. It wasn't just COVID and COVID relief dollars. It was Freedom Summer of 2020, 2021. What did that mean? That means that once again, with the lynching of a Black man, George Floyd and others, and with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an opportunity where the federal government, through COVID relief funds, corporate industry, through giving to whether it's Black Lives Matter or something that was about African-American society, states and city government did for HBCUs what they have historically done for Harvard's, for Yale, for Princeton, for Stanford, and for all the others. And that is give the support to build and invest in the infrastructure that will ultimately create the institutions that will allow for access and affordability and ultimately the transcendence of the social ills that affect us in America today. With this COVID funding and this parity, we began to see that HBCUs were leaders in doing what? Giving the dollars to students to pay off student debt. To be able to support strategic plans, to deal with deferred maintenance, to increase and to deal with all of the various deserts that our institutions are often in, not just food deserts, but technology deserts, not just technology deserts, but access to capital, access to business, access to opportunities. We're excited that you have the opportunity to support, to lobby, to put your voice to President Biden's attempt to increase and maximize this funding in the HBCU capacity and infrastructure grants through Title III, through increasing Pell, to ensure that we have an opportunity to provide effective, quality, and sustainable access to affordable higher education. Thank you, and I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Dr. Lucas. And this is really great. We're hearing, again, the intent of really this this panel and this convening is really, again, a microcosm of CEF, which we want to hear about how and why these funds are needed across the continuum. So really appreciate that. And let's keep moving with Jennifer.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. On behalf of the National Association of Workforce Boards, I'm Jennifer Harris, Chair of the National Association, or NAWB Board of Directors. Professionally, I'm the owner and founder of CR Search, an executive recruiting firm. I've been in the recruiting industry for over 25 years. So when I learned about my local workforce board over 10 years ago, it was a great opportunity to not only serve my community, but to bring my many years of talent and talent development experience to the table. NAWB is the national voice for the nation's 576 workforce development boards, the regional and local business-led organizations that convene and collaborate to reduce unemployment, boost economic development by aligning federal, state, and local investments in preparing job seekers and connecting employers with a highly skilled workforce. And we created a short video to illustrate how we work. If Max, you'd be so kind to play that video.
Sorry, folks, a minute, 1 sec.
Board is a formal group of community leaders serving a city, a county, or a region that identifies the needs of the local job market, oversees one-stop career centers, and works to coordinate and align workforce development initiatives in their area. Workforce development boards with membership from business, local elected officials, labor, economic development, educators, and community leaders foster high-growth career opportunities to meet the needs of their regional economy. This system exists to help businesses find qualified workers to meet their present and future workforce needs and help workers acquire skills for employment opportunities. A workforce development board is the link between a region's workforce talent and its employer skill needs. They convene industry and their workforce and education partners in real time to impact the skilling and reskilling of America's workforce and put people back to work in career pathways that provide self-sufficiency. Together, this diverse group of leaders helps your community target recruitment opportunities, identify labor market trends, partner on economic development investments, and create resources to benefit all members of the community. Every Workforce Development Board has a plan that establishes funding priorities for their area focused on a broad range of worker issues that consider wages, job mobility, access, and equity. By analyzing data and working with local businesses, workforce boards understand what skills are most in demand and foster the necessary training and credential programs for their region. Workforce boards also use outcome data to advise employers, policymakers, and communities about what approaches are successful. So without your local workforce development boards, local businesses, educational institutions, and other community stakeholders would not have a strong voice to represent the unique workforce needs of your community. So what is a workforce development board? It is a key link to your community's future.
Thanks, Max. So what is the current state of employment in America today? We know there's a significant talent shortage in the US, and the shortfall is expected to persist for the foreseeable future. Anyone who is an employer or hiring manager on this call, this is not news to you. There are several variables at play in the market that are accounting for this, which is a whole separate webinar. But here's some data to consider. As of February 2022, there were 11.3 million job openings, but only 6.3 million unemployed individuals were looking for work. So how do we fill the 5 million plus job gap? To address the labor shortage, it's vital for businesses to engage populations that, historically, are less likely to be working. Individuals with disadvantaged backgrounds, veterans, individuals with disability, and justice-involved citizens. Fortunately, WIOA, or the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, was enacted exactly for this purpose, to prepare all individuals, regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances, for family-sustaining employment. In regards to policy, which is the next slide, WIOA, again, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is the legislative vehicle that creates the who and the how of the workforce development boards. An important note of WIOA is that each workforce board must be 51% comprised of private business members, which is important as the system is designed to be business-led, to respond to the demand of what the industry tells us they need in terms of skilled employees. On a personal note, my background is in talent acquisition. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, the last 9 owning my own recruiting firm. Talent solutions, like most strategies, fall into 2 main categories, short-term and long-term. Short-term are the jobs that are open right now. Long-term is developing talent for the future. Workforce development is similar in that our American Job Centers help employers find talent today, as well as developing talent for the future. This cycle is longer than election cycles. It's difficult to measure long-term success before the next election. So it's my feeling that workforce funding suffers from the lack of long-term thinking by politicians that are unable or unwilling to invest in long-term strategies. Results are not always immediate in workforce development. The skills gap that we in education and workforce have been talking about for years is here, and it could have been mitigated if the system had been properly funded to prepare workers for the wave of technology that we knew was coming. We are experiencing the danger of that strategy now, meaning low funding and short-term thinking, both in education and workforce, by not being able to keep up with the pace at which business demands new skills. Add to that a pandemic that literally redefined the nature of work overnight, means our systems lack critical resources and funding that make it extremely difficult to respond to the needs of business today. However, it's imperative that leaders like us continue to advocate for education in all forms, so that we can prepare people for the critical skills they need for this economy or the next. There are some workforce boards in this country that are doing exceptional work, engaging both the business community and marginalized communities. Because at Workforce, we have 2 customers, the businesses who hire and the job seekers who have both short-term and long-term needs of their own. Some job seekers need a job right now. Some may be looking to improve their skills or acquire new skills that will enable them to reach the next level of their career, or possibly even find a new career. For businesses, they need to access the talent now, as well as ensure the skills they need for tomorrow are being addressed. The Workforce Board in Las Vegas, Nevada has worked with their community libraries to create business hubs, places within the libraries where businesses learn more about workforce development, have space for meetings, or even hold interviews. In Lake County, Illinois, my local board, our workforce boards created Revive Lake County, which is a 5-week award-winning program for returning citizens that provide job readiness skills, including learning about career pathways, life and employment skills, with the goal of increasing their chances of finding employment after the release from our county jail. Many workforce boards are also exploring trauma-based coaching as well as family-centered employment. The idea that we can alleviate poverty by just providing training without care or concern for the individual or their circumstances is short-sighted. Acquiring skills for employment is important, but consideration for childcare, transportation, mental health, and other wraparound services is imperative for sustainable employment. And that is the goal. Let's just not check a box, but provide access to education and training opportunities that open the doors for greater economic mobility for individuals and families. Back to WIOA funding, because this work isn't possible without a serious investment in the workforce boards that provide the connections for businesses and job seekers. Here are some data points as it relates to current and proposed WIOA funding. Currently, funding is at historic lows, and adjusted for inflation is $3 billion less than in the year 2000. So think about that. When we talk about long-term and short-term consequences, our federal funding is less than it was 22 years ago. And businesses wonder why they can't find skilled workers. But a reauthorization of WIOA was recently passed in the House, which would fund the system by more than $75 billion over a 5-year period. However, the Senate has shown no indication that the bill will be considered this congressional session. Healthcare, manufacturing, construction, and the transportation logistics industries are the 4 top sectors represented in the training services provided and most reflected in where participants are ultimately employed. With this funding, boards can connect people directly to work in either on-the-job or apprenticeship types of opportunities, with the goal of providing family-sustaining wages and breaking the cycles of poverty. The recent legislation would expand wraparound services to increase job retention. How many of us know someone who had to quit their job because of losing childcare or their transportation? Again, training alone doesn't solve those issues. There's also clearly a worker participation problem in the United States. Reshuffling or the Great Resignation and reconsideration of how someone wants to work and reluctance about being in the job market at all are all happening in this market. However, through workforce development boards and America's job centers, there is a path for those who want to reenter the job market. We need to make it easier to attain meaningful employment by providing access to opportunities and reducing the barriers that are keeping people out of the labor force. Local workforce boards boast entered employment rates, or people who find employment after completing one of our programs, of over 72%. We have proven results that show connecting individuals to education and training programs result in sustainable employment. Even though we are making a difference, some additional considerations are that learners of all ages still currently lack access to federal financial support needed to access skill development opportunities that lead to sustainable employment. We are moving the needle, but more can and should be done. Broadening eligibility requirements to the federal Pell Grant program to include high-quality, short-term post-secondary programs would, for the first time, provide much-needed federal support for training experiences leading to in-demand careers. The Jumpstart Our Business by Supporting Students, or JOBS Act, currently under consideration as part of congressional economic competitiveness legislation, would take an important first step in addressing this issue. And as shown through WIOA, data is the most important aspect when measuring outcomes. As the partner of many educational institutions, NAWB is also supportive of the College Transparency Act, which would improve our understanding of how education workforce development investments impact learners and improve our economy. So the last slide is just my conclusion. WIOA has historically been a bipartisan issue, and this legacy should continue. It's a collaborative legislative vehicle that combines successes across the political spectrum and is proven to be effective. Workforce development boards act as conveners in the communities, connecting job seekers and businesses, in addition to partnering with education and economic development stakeholders to lift up communities, creating greater access to opportunities, diversifying our workforce, and breaking down the barriers to family sustaining employment. So my last slide is just my contact information, as well as Kyle Marinelli, who's the Manager of Policy and Government Relations at NAWB, who I just want to thank for also putting together this presentation. And we do have a more detailed slide deck available to all the participants of this call that details funding and provides much more data, but certainly didn't want to bore too many folks with that.
Thanks, Jennifer. No, that was great. Thanks for that wonderful overview of workforce boards. And something you said in your presentation was a connection with libraries, which you know, the interconnectedness of these programs is there, and it's important for us to showcase those. And speaking of libraries, our last presenter, and certainly not least, is Patience Frederiksen. So Patience, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to speak to everyone attending this webinar. I've worked in libraries since 1975 when I got a study job at my Carnegie Mellon University Library. And I just have immersed myself in libraries and love this field dearly. I will say that my division is part of the Alaska Department of Education and Early Development. And our commissioner came in and gave us a nice, worked with us to develop a nice, fresh branding logo for the department, which is an excellent education every day for every student. And it's one that everybody in the department can remember. And it's quite the touchstone for people in my division and across the department. Next slide, please. Our primary agency at the federal level to support libraries is the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It's a fairly small unit. There are a number of different grant programs to museums and to libraries. The largest of the grant programs is the Library Services and Technology Act Block Grant Program. And that is the one through which my library, my division, receives $1.1 million annually. And we use it to provide a number of different services statewide. We provide grants to all types of libraries, and there are 5 types of libraries. There are public libraries, there are school libraries in your schools, there are academic libraries at colleges, there are special libraries that work in government and corporate areas, and finally, the newest group is tribal libraries. The first 3, public libraries, school libraries, and academic libraries, play a huge role in supporting education. Obviously, academic and school libraries, just by the function that they are paid for by the university or the school to serve students and faculty. Public libraries provide support for education outside of school hours, and we do this with a number of different programs and services. The way we use the grants is listed there on the slide, and I'll go through some of those examples in the next slide, please. One of the major areas, one of the areas in which we give consistently are reading motivation grants. We all know literacy is a huge concern, especially with the losses in reading scores over the years of remote schooling due to the pandemic. 2 of the programs that we support every single year is Battle of the Books and the Summer Reading Program. We give grants to the Alaska Association of School Libraries to run the Battle of the Books program, and it has a huge impact statewide, 15,000 students every single year. The Summer Reading Program allows public libraries to offer summer reading programs, and they give the kids awards, and there are there's a lot of posters and encouragement for kids to read. And that's to prevent the slide in summer reading reading scores over the summer. That has been documented in a number of different studies. Some of the project grants that we give, a Big Reads program. The NEH has a program called the Big Reads, in which a community reads a single book. And we end up also supporting those programs. A community or a school may engage by reading the same book, having author visits and discussions of the book. The Anchorage Public Library held a unique project in November 2020, in which kids got to vote on their favorite books at the same time as we were going to the polls nationally. And finally, the League of Women Voters, they partnered with the Juneau Public Library, and we funded distributing this book to every school library in the state. Elizabeth Peratrovich is very well known in Alaska, not well known around the country. And there was actually no published book on her. We always had to refer people to web pages and other sources. So to have at least this book out there that documents her amazing life and her impact on civil rights for Alaska Natives is a real godsend because we know it's out there now. Next slide, please. In Alaska, we have very, very, very many small libraries and a few large ones. Very few of our libraries can provide commercial databases for research services. And so in about 1998, Alaska created SLED, the Statewide Library Electronic Doorway. This is our portal to over 50 databases. In Alaska, these are available to students, to families, business, schools, homes, anywhere you have access to the internet, you can get to our databases. We spend about $800,000 a year on these databases, and we get about 1 million uses annually, though I actually think that number is a little bit off. I think it's low. These are some of the databases that are purchased for everyone to use statewide. And these are ones that support K-12 education primarily. I'm not sure, BrainPop is very popular, and I can go through all of those, but you can see the sort of services that these support from elementary school things, the BrainPop with the animated films, the EBSCO databases that index magazines at different grade levels, Novelist. Sometimes kids really want to get into series, or they've read one book and they want to read another one like that. And so Novelist suggests that to them. So this provides equity across Alaska. Everybody in the state can access the same databases. And that is crucial in a state that is as rural as Alaska, and in which revenues and government and supporting schools are so wildly divergent. Next slide, please. Of course, we have people living in Alaska with no public libraries whatsoever. And so we have these red bags. The Alaska Mail Services, the Juneau Public Library, gets an annual grant from us to provide mail services for people. One of the other aspects of this is that the kids who are living in families that are getting this service can call, or they can write and they can say, I need to do a paper on this. And the librarians at Juneau Public Library will go out and do the research for that student and send that student the book and the materials he needs to create his report. It's really pretty impressive what's available there. And so this also helps to level the playing field so that people living in towns without libraries can get access to some of the wealth of information that we all take for granted in well-connected communities. Next slide, please. And of course, another group of patrons that we continue to serve are those who are print disabled. This people who have visual disabilities, people who have dyslexia, and people who physically cannot hold print books. We provide the Talking Book Center service with using federal funds to pay for this service. And it's sort of like the original Netflix. This one came around in 1931. And what happens is that people will call the Talking Book Center, order the books they want, and they will be mailed to the person. Sounds just like Netflix, but we sort of predated Netflix by about 80 or 90 years. The original iteration of this program was that LPs, long playing albums, were shipped out. And they came in these large orange cases because a book might be a couple of different albums. And they said it was the bane of every postman to have a lot of large print of these LPs in these orange cases coming to a patron. In subsequent years, the system transferred to cassettes, just the cassettes that we all played in our cars for ages and ages. And now the information is recorded on thumb drives that are embedded in a cassette that goes into the machine. And it's also downloadable for many of our patrons who have access to good internet. This continues to provide support and reading engagement for students of all ages. And we're quite proud of that service because that community loves this service. They're big readers and they really appreciate having access to this. Next slide, please. One of the other ways that we use Library Services and Technology Act federal funds is to provide continuing education and scholarships for library. Every field of endeavor needs to have a well-trained workforce, as Jennifer said earlier. And so we have used our federal funding for a number of different things that we do, a number of scholarships and then ongoing training afterwards. I couldn't avoid the chance of acknowledging Dr. Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress. For years, we've had librarians of Congress that were not librarians, and to get Dr. Carla Hayden in there, who is a librarian and is running the Library of Congress, my whole profession was dancing in the streets when she was selected by President Obama. Next slide, please. One of the types of programs that I don't see much about, but I hear about these grants, are the Innovative Approaches to Literacy grants. And Alaska gets 2 or 3 of these every year. They are large grants over a number of years to address literacy issues within a school district. And here's an example of what the Dillingham School District is doing with their Innovative Approaches to Literacy grant. I know that they are partnering with the public library for some of the list of services they're providing to enhance literacy in Dillingham. And so that's an interesting program. I'm always fascinated to see what school districts get it and what they plan to do with it. I should note that Representative Don Young, who recently passed away, was a huge supporter of Innovative Approaches to Literacy. He always sponsored the Dear Colleague letter that he asked members of Congress to support Innovative Approaches to Literacy funding. He was a school teacher in Fort Yukon, and he continued to support education, at least from my point of view, in terms of these grants. I'm sure he supported education in many other programs and budgetary items that came forward. Next slide, please. One of the areas that links up to education, but it also just links up to providing good library service, is to have the infrastructure. Until 1995, the law through which libraries received money from IMLS was the Library Services and Construction Act. And that granted money to every state library so that we had another funding source that we would then refund, give sub-grants to local libraries as they were doing renovations or new library buildings. In 1995, that law sunsetted and it came back as the Library Services and Technology Act. There has been no federal funding to help local communities build libraries since 1995. And we're really beginning to see a problem with this. So one of the demands of technology, of course, are amazing. And in Alaska, we have a huge problem with housing and buildings. And so this is one of our newer public libraries in Edna Bay, and their entire power source is a generator that's plugged in on the back step. It would be wonderful to have federal funding come forward again for library infrastructure projects like this. It's a critical need to support libraries nationwide. And there are more public libraries nationwide than there are McDonald's. And we do need support from the federal government. We appreciate LSTA and the schools appreciate the Innovative Approaches, but we really do need some infrastructure funding at this point as well. Next slide, please. I would be amiss if I did not note the impact of the American Rescue Plan Act grants the funding that we received from an IMLS last year. We normally get 1.1 million. Last year, we got 2.2 million in ARPA funds in addition to the LSTA. We normally give out 40 grants a year. Last year, we gave out 114 ARPA grants and about 40 LSTA grants. So it was a huge impact. We were going grant crazy here last year. The other thing that IMLS required was that the ARPA funds have to be spent by September 30th. There's a distribution there. You can see how libraries applied and what we funded. A big thank you to Congress for the ARPA grants. It was a once in a lifetime disbursement. And I will probably never see anything like that again, at least I hope not pandemic driven for sure. But we appreciated it, and we're going to see the reports coming in on these grants in September. Next slide, please. So overall, I figured I would just bluntly say what the ask is. We would appreciate Congress support funding of at least $232 million for library services and technology, $50 million for the innovative approaches to literacy, and support funding to renovate and modernize library facilities through the Build America's Libraries Act. And that is pretty much it. Next slide. There's my information if you need to contact me. If you actually just look up Alaska State Library, you'll be able to find my contact information as this slide deck goes off. Thank you so much for an opportunity to talk about libraries and how they support education. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Patience, and thanks to all of our panelists for those great overviews. That was really helpful. I learned a ton, and again, just reinforces the importance of the work here. We're gonna shift gears here a little bit. We're gonna start have a few Q&A, or start the Q&A portion, have a few questions for panelists. And I think what we'll do is we'll start with one for all the panelists, and anyone can jump in, and then I'm gonna do my best to try to squeeze in an individual question for each panelist. So I wanna start with something that Patience ended with there, which is ARP funds or pandemic relief funding. So, and this is really important and when we're talking about what the purpose of this briefing is, which is on FY23 budget, because all of these things are related and there's certainly interplay here. So let's start with that. Why don't you, anyone can sort of start us off here, but why don't you give us one example of a way that you, your industry, your sector sort of use pandemic relief funding, and that can be any of the three tranches. And then also, if you would quickly give an example of still an unmet need or something you're seeing in terms of increased costs. So an example of funds that how you use the funds, but then still some sort of a remaining need, I guess.
I'll go ahead and start. So 26 states have currently used ARPA funding for workforce initiatives. Here locally in Lake County, we received $3 million from our county, and we're using it to train and do on-the-job apprenticeship type trainings for 100 people that may or may not be qualified under WIOA. So WIOA is extremely labor intensive in terms of being able to qualify for programs. There's 14 different areas, and some folks, let's say out of school youth, there might be somebody who is out of school, it might be 25 and not fit the 18 to 24 category, and we're going to be able to use those ARPA funds to help that person with tuition, books, fees for a program that they otherwise may not be qualified for. We also are using it to do some outreach. We cannot use WIOA funding for marketing per se for our job centers. So we like to say we're a well-kept secret, but that's no prop to us. Nobody likes to be a well-kept secret, right? That's not something to be proud of. So we're going to be able to do some really intentional outreach to some communities that we may not have been able to serve otherwise.
Danny, if I may, I'll jump in here. The federal funding for pandemic relief is greatly appreciated by public schools. We were able to respond very quickly to a very unprecedented time. And because of the money and the infusion of those monies, we were able to update our technology. We were able to bring one-to-one computing to life, K through 12. The distance learning that we were able to provide, even a rural setting, made a big difference of keeping kiddos connected to their schools and their educational progress. One of the unmet needs, though, and I think this is not unique to my district, but across the country, and Patients referred to it, as infrastructure needs. I know that we have a major HVAC upgrade planned, and AASA has asked Congress for an 18-month extension for expenditures of monies for this purpose because of supply shortages, workforce shortages. To get all these projects done within the timeline is very, very difficult, and some construction assets aren't available to us. So that extension would be a wonderful blessing for schools across the country.
I think I'm the next in order of the presentation. so I'll jump in. I think that ARP, as Patience mentioned, I think Jennifer also did, and HERF was the other iteration of it that impacted us, were, I think, essential. As I said, in our space, we call it a freedom summer because the number one issue that higher education faces across the board is student debt. And what the funds first allowed was to provide some level of funding directly to students to deal with, one, their student gaps. And the student gap is just the amount that they can afford to borrow versus the cost of education. The second is to deal with the various deserting that is often around HBCUs and minority serving institutions, which is direct access to food, direct access to technology, and direct access to housing. What we often sometimes forget is that for many students who live at or below the poverty line, that the campus is the place to go for home. And oftentimes when you say, oh, it's COVID, everybody go home and isolate. Well, go home where? Always going home is not a option for many students. And so the ability for funding to institutions like HBCUs, the opportunity to provide housing, safe housing, where they are often safer on our campuses, they are in the communities in which they come to us from. We also were able, just like James said, major pivot of entering into technology and allowing us to accelerate infrastructure. Many of us were in the cloud, but now the funding and support allowed us to put our culture in the cloud, right? And to be able to allow student support services, to allow mental health check-ins, and to really accelerate our ability to do student support. I think the other that goes with this is the federal support for holding off on student loan payments. That was a big deal because particularly in an inflationary economy, where do you get more money to pay back student debt, pay back student loans to continue your education? If you are a graduate and need to go and get a master's level doctoral degree, it allowed for some help to families. I think the last is the ability for infrastructure and renewal, and that deferred maintenance that I mentioned earlier is a big deal. The ability to make repairs so that the business can continue, because it's not just students alone, but faculty and staff, and everybody was struggling. I think the continued need is very, very clear for us. The increased threat, and I loved it how particularly the comments were made earlier. Jennifer too hit on some great points when it comes to the preparation and our ability to compete through workforce development globally. And when it comes to the need for protecting against cybersecurity threats and continued infrastructure, we are now all on the cloud. And so when you have all these students learning on the cloud and all these cybersecurity threats, you have to do some things to communicate and to deal with your infrastructure very differently. The continued need for construction. I mean, look, anybody who saw patients with the picture of the generator for a library, I mean, come on, if that doesn't touch your heart, I mean, what does? There's so many of us that are suffering with infrastructure needs. And thanks to patients, I have this new desert, intelligence desert. I mean, right? People can't get information and can't learn. Also, enrollment stabilization initiatives that are ultimately needed. And then the disruption through K-12 also of teacher education. Everybody couldn't pivot to a private tutor, right? Everybody can't pivot to online education. We found that many of our students don't perform well virtually. That while they go there, learning loss, well, that's not a new term. Some were left behind long before learning loss ever emerged. And so when you're talking about being behind while you're in the classroom and then now have to be behind even more, how do you do that? And so investing in Upward Bound, investing in these student support services, investing in TRIO programming, and investing more in McNair Scholars Program is even more needed now. I think joining James, we have a lot of people to thank, right? Congressman Bobby Scott, if your team is listening, thank you. Of course, Congresswoman Adams from North Carolina, thank her, and all those who have championed the cause to make these opportunities available.
I would add, just from Alaska's point of view, and one of the things we haven't discussed at this forum is the absolutely critical nature of the E-rate program and broadband support. Alaska is finally coming to terms in opening a broadband office so that we can be ready to receive the broadband money from the federal government. This is going to be a huge windfall. The need in Alaska for broadband support is just, it's monstrous. We cannot do fiber across glaciers and rivers. Just doesn't happen. And so we have low Earth orbit satellites, nets that are going up. And then we also have satellite internet. And if we didn't have E-rate to support schools and libraries, we would be in a very bad place. I'm sure Maine is in the same place. All of the states that have rural areas are just so reliant on E-rate, and we watch that program like a hawk.
That's a great point. And that is something I think in terms of future funding, I think Alaska and many other states, the pandemic sort of elevated this issue, and it's certainly one that folks are locked into. Okay, so I'm going to now attempt, we have a little time left, but we're running a little low. So what I'm going to try to do is give folks an individual question on their area. And if you could try, give us a flavor to just kind of give us a sense, and just want to make sure that there's time for everyone to answer a question. So I'm going to start with you, Jennifer. So just on this idea of the recession and how it's shifted needs, there's certainly every industry has changed kind of post-pandemic, but in thinking about workforce development, give folks a sense of how the pandemic sort of changed needs, and then what could some of these federal funding streams do to support that. You're on mute. Yeah.
Forgive me. So yeah, the pandemic changed people's perspective on work, right? And what work-life balance meant and where they were working. But just like we were talking about a minute ago, if you have no digital literacy skills, don't have access to Wi-Fi, you don't have a choice to work from home. So, you know, the pandemic did increase demand for labor, and wages have increased, which is great. You know, the job seeker's in a strong position today, but that still doesn't solve the skills gap or the digital literacy divide that exists between, you know, those with educations and those without. And someone had said something really important, saying, you know, digital literacy is not just access to Wi-Fi, right? There's a whole host of skills that are needed to perform well in that kind of economy. So I think that, you know, workforce development continues to need federal support to increase education and opportunity for folks that are in marginalized communities without this access, BIPOC communities, returning citizens, those with disabilities, you know, so that they can enhance those skills and participate in those in-demand careers today, post-pandemic.
That's excellent, thanks. And Dr. Lucas, we had a note in the chat that the House Ed and Labor is listening, and we appreciate your gratitude and support. So how about that? Captive audience. So actually, let's continue with you, Dr. Lucas. I think you touched on this a little bit, Pell Grants, but President's budget for next year would increase the maximum Pell Grant by more than 35% and boost other student aid while increasing institutional support for HBCUs and colleges serving low-income and high-need students. Just give us a sense of how this would impact your students at Virginia Union University going forward.
Well, I think I can speak generally because many of us in our space, in the market segment, will be impacted similarly. First of all, I mean, look, the House Ed and Labor is listening. Hey, you guys, thank you for listening, and hopefully you will continue to fight for us as you have. And of course, the ranking member, Congressman Chair, he's done a great job. But I think Emmanuel did a great summary once again in his research study and extending back, I hope I can say, the work that he did at UNCF in really laying out for us the impact that we are very, very clear about. You know, I think Jennifer, James, Patience, everybody has laid out what we know is true, that there are many different Americas that we all are living in, right? And our ability to access the resources to support a desire to get out of poverty, to better ourselves, to live totally as human beings, and to pursue the American dream is there. For historically Black colleges and universities, look, the Pell Grant is essential as we've laid out for very, very many reasons. Why? Because, there's a cost to ultimately education, and it's not a one-fit-all solution, but the Pell Granting is necessary. I think Emmanuel also not only identifying the research and the impacts, but also makes a very, very important discovery. Well, that the HBCU funds and the dollars that were set forth have never been at their maximum amount. And so for President Biden to do this is historic, to say, look, we always have known that we've set a limit for how much we will fund HBCU support. We just have never had in the history of the United States. And finally, in 2022, after a national pandemic, after a civil rights movement, after Reconstruction, all that, we're finally going to give the maximum resources because we really believe in these institutions is a big deal. I think beyond that, we have to acknowledge that the African-American and those who are living below the poverty line experience the difficulties of pandemic type situations every day. The realities of the pandemic didn't create issues with healthcare, did not create issues with education and technology gaps, but they just exacerbated a situation that we knew was there, and it worsened. And these are the reasons why the necessity for support today, now more than ever, is needed in our space.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lucas. Patience, so you talked about this a little bit. You talked about how the Federal Pandemic Relief Fund, how that enabled you all to do more and reach more folks. But you talked about one of your missions, or your mission with your organization, is about excellent education and increasing teaching and learning. So just give us a sense on that, just in terms of what additional federal funding increases, how can that impact your work and help you to sort of build capacity and sort of reach more folks?
Well, from the library's point of view, increased capacity would allow us to do a number of things. One of the messages I saw recently was from 2 librarians discussing the fact that they used ARPA grants to buy Wi-Fi hotspots that are circulating. They can't keep them in the library. They're getting checked out constantly. But because we don't have that many great cell networks up here in these areas, they also have to buy cards that allow them to have internet access. And their concern is, how are they going to be able to keep checking out the Wi-Fi hotspots when they don't have a funding source for these internet cards to go out with them? So that's one of the issues is, you can buy capital, you can buy equipment, but the support for some of that really needs to go on. We would see that. We could obviously do a lot more getting more of our content online, which libraries that had already sort of done that. We had lots of digitization projects. And so when the pandemic came and everybody shut down, we were able to retool pretty quickly in terms of access to online services. SLED had been around for 25 years. All we said was, you got to start using SLED. We had a digital library with ebooks and audiobooks that could be downloaded. Those took off. We saw statistics just climbing on usage because those were already ready because the libraries were closed down. And we did not know if the COVID-19 virus would be spread by people checking out library books. We were discussing, cleaning the books, washing them, putting them in a room and letting them sit for 5 days to make sure it was dead. So, there were a lot of issues with that, especially at the beginning. So, buying more electronic materials and getting access to electronic materials, everybody seems to think everything is on the internet. I work in a library. I can assure you, not everything is on the internet. It's going to take years to get everything on the internet. So those would be ways that would really have a long-term impact, is to get more and more closer to the Star Trek thing where you got the library computer. God help us, we won't have librarians, but so it goes. doing more of what we were able to start with ARPA would be great. And that's one of the problems I'm facing was we're not quite sure how to help those libraries meet the fact that we don't have funding for those cards, for those things that they got used to for ARPA for 1 year. So
that's great. That's super helpful. Thanks for that perspective. And then James, wanted to end on this with you with IDEA. We talked to any superintendent around the country, and IDEA is obviously a huge front and center issue, and for obvious reasons. Federal government has the pledge, of course, of covering up to 40% of additional associated costs to serve students with disabilities, but we know that this number has never approached that level, and as it currently hovers around 13%. Just talk about, from a superintendent's perspective, the district's perspective, what it would mean and there are increases in this FY23 budget. What would that mean for districts across the country?
That'd be a tremendous relief on so many different levels. Right now, the funding gap that's created by underfunding the 40%, money's being picked up by the locals. Okay, that's your local towns and regions that are raising taxes to fill in those gaps. The needs for our students are increasing. They're not going away. And to serve those students properly, it's going to take quite an investment. With those additional funds, that's going to relieve some pressure on the additional local funds we're raising and allow us to do more for all students. Unfortunately, when you have to make very difficult choices on finite resources, sometimes you're taking from one area to support another. Obviously, when we have federal mandates requiring programming and solutions for individuals with disabilities, that challenges the rest of the areas of education. So additional funding would be like a rising tide. All boats would rise on that tide in the harbor. It would be critical, it would be greatly appreciated, and it would help everybody.
Thanks for that, James. Yeah, such a pressing issue. Okay, we've got 2 minutes before I turn it over to my great colleague, Jenny Smolson. I'm going to try to do something. You're each going to get 30 seconds. And here's the challenge. You've got to make your argument in 30 seconds. What is your argument to convince Congress about the need for increased federal education investment? We know that we have CEF has a 5 cents make sense campaign, but currently the federal budget only allots about 2% of the federal budget to education. James, you ended, so why don't we come back around? Your turn.
Right off the bat, I'll come at you with, and Dr. Lucas mentioned this, and I couldn't agree more with him. Education is an equalizer, it's a game changer. Creating opportunity and access for education for all Americans is critical for personal development, but most importantly for civic development, our country, and economic development.
Great job, thanks. Jennifer.
So I would just say, to remain competitive in an increasingly crowded global economy, to address the labor participation rate, to increase access to skills and opportunities for underrepresented communities. More must be invested in education that leads directly to sustainable and meaningful employment.
Terrific. Dr. Lucas?
Our words and our work must always be dedicated to those who have gone on before us and the living who are amongst us. Those who are listening, as I just was tagged in LinkedIn, Kiana K. Bird, MPA, keep doing the great work. If you want us to continue to be a great nation, continue to invest in education and HBCUs.
Excellent. And Patience, close us out.
It's an eye-opener to me that this country, rich as it is, only spends 2% of its federal budget on education. I had no idea it was that low. And I have to admit, I'm really totally shocked. I can tell you that what it spends on libraries is way less than that. And I do believe libraries punch above their funding level in providing support across all sectors, K-12, college, lifelong learning. I believe if this country were to invest more in education, 5–10%, who knows what we could do. We're certainly not competitive on a national level. And I think we have to get back to those days when Sputnik went up and this country woke up. I think it's time for more funding for education. Thank you so much.
Amen. Well, I am going to now thank you, panelists. I'm going to close it out to, or I'm sorry, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who's going to close things out for us.
Yes, thank you, Danny. And I just want to, on behalf of the Committee for Education Funding, or CEF, we just want to offer a sincere thanks to you amazing, knowledgeable, engaging panelists, as well as to all of our participants who joined us today. CEF members and congressional staff will receive a link to our CEF FY23 budget book. That budget book is also available to CEF members on the CEF website under the member area. So check that out, as well as all the related charts and materials. Hill staff, you can request a physical hard copy of that book, which many of us love, by emailing CEF at info@cef.org. Provide us with your name, your congressional office, and we'll make sure to arrange a delivery to you in early June. And of course, we just want you to remain engaged with our community. So we invite you to visit our website at cef.org. Join us on social media, on Instagram and Twitter at edfunding on Twitter and Instagram, and of course on Facebook at the Committee for Education Funding. So again, our sincere thanks to panelists, participants, and join us to increase federal funding for education.